I do kind of think you can draw an interesting parallel, and if you allow me to maybe slowly but surely kind of transition into Dortmund here,
Mm,
um, if you want to kind of draw a comparison between the way that Dortmund have dealt with Erling Haaland leaving the club and the way that Bayern have dealt with Robert Lewandowski leaving the club,
yeah.
it's completely different, And actually, my newsletter this week is actually on the way that Dortmund's kind of patchwork of forwards this season have really kind of through hook or by crook, have managed to really compensate for Haaland leaving. If you kind of look at the first half of the season, you had Yusuf Makuku step in, who
Mm,
really out of necessity because obviously Haller was picked up, the cancer diagnosis and he couldn't play.
mm,
Anthony Modeste was kind of parachuted into this team, which didn't really work at all. So Makuku steps up to the plate. He does tremendously well. But you also had a kind of strong kind of supporting cast of Marco Reus, Jude Bellingham, Julian Brandt, really stepping up and saying, right, well, if our strikers are out of action and our wide forwards in Daniel Malin and Adiemi aren't, either fit or in form, our midfielders will step up.
mm,
And that's what happened in the first half. And don't get me wrong, Dortmund weren't great in the first half of the season. They were
mhm.
sixth, I think, at the
Yeah.
end of the Hinrunde. They were, 9 points behind Bayern, I think. But if you kind of look at the way that front line really developed, arguably because they had most of them did have a kind of second pre-season in the sense that Daniel Malin obviously managed to get his sharpness and his fitness back. Adeyemi was able to finally kind of settle into the club. We saw Sébastien Haller kind of come into the team eventually as well ahead of schedule. Um, and perhaps just importantly, actually, Guerrero actually managed to look like his old self again, and he's really been an outstanding playmaker in the second half of the
Mm,
season. But the point is, Dortmund are now finishing the season with this tremendous supporting class of forward players. If you look at the way they beat, Augsburg at the weekend, yes, it took some time and a red card perhaps, but you had, Sebastian Haller looking at his best, Daniel Malin with a really tremendous turn of pace. I can't remember if it was for one of the goals or if it was maybe for the Adeyemi chance that he should have finished. And then Adeyemi, of course, looking extremely dangerous. Not to mention the fact that Julian Brandt
mm,
gets on the scoreline. And this is all, and then Marco Reus as well actually came very close when he came on. And this is all without Jude Bellingham even on the pitch.
yeah.
Now, you compare that performance from all those players to what happened at Bayern Munich, and you got a Bayern team who basically made no effort to really replace Lewandowski. They brought in Sadio Mane, tried to shoehorn him in, which didn't work.
Mm,
They then had to resort on Choupo-Moting, who did his best, but is obviously not the same quality of Lewandowski. But there was never any kind of conscious effort made to be like, right, Gnabry, you have to. I mean, I suppose Gnabry has scored a decent amount of goals, but like Leroy Sané, Coman, Gnabry, whoever else, like we all have to score an extra 5 goals each this season because Lewandowski's not his team.
mm,
Whether I'm sure maybe Nagelsmann and Tuchel have said that on the training pitch, but it doesn't feel like these players have actually made the effort to step up. And where you have a Dortmund team that have not only players on the pitch in wide positions or in the middle of the park, or even in the case of Guerrero, like at left back at times, stepping up and trying to be counted.
mm,
You've got this Bayern team that everyone's just completely, shirking from responsibility, hiding from the limelight, determined not to kind of be the guy that everything's dependent on. So I just think those are such interesting contrasts to the way both of these teams have reacted to losing the player that scored all the goals for them. Because
yeah.
if you look at everyone's talking about how much Bayern have missed Lewandowski, but you forget that Erling Haaland scored or assisted like 35% of Dortmund's league goals last season.
Mhm.
So I just think that's an interesting contrast, and perhaps why Dortmund have looked so much better in the second half of the season and now look good to win the Bundesliga title.
Or you just look at some of the numbers, right, for Sebastian Haller. He's now scored 9 goals and 5 assists in 18 Bundesliga games, right? That's a goal every 127 minutes because you have to remember he didn't feature for over the full 90 minutes in all of these games because he was literally recovering from cancer, which is a crazy story when you think about it, right? So he's currently on pace to score on every second game. And when you go by numbers, it's actually just above goal a game. Again, that's insane. But you actually look at the form table in the Bundesliga, and when you take the first 16 matches where Borussia Dortmund were without Sebastian Haller, Dortmund were sixth in the standings with 28 points, 7 points behind Bayern Munich, right? Haller came back on match day 16, which is after the World Cup break. Since then, Borussia Dortmund in 18 games have won 14, drawn 3, lost just 1, scored an insane 56 goals, right? Which is the most in the Bundesliga by 15. Bayern Munich is second with 41. But also in terms of points, Borussia Dortmund in the last 18 games, so since the World Cup break, have collected 45 points, which is 10 more than RB Leipzig, who was sitting in second place, and 11 points more than Bayern Munich. And, you look at that, that is incredible. That's incredible. And you can draw the parallel to, Borussia Dortmund, they buy the player to replace Erling Haaland. They go into the new season with that player. Player gets a horrible cancer diagnosis. They have to then go and poach Anthony Modeste from Köln, right? And we can all agree that is an interesting idea, a good concept, but not the player that will, not the same caliber kind of player. Sebastian Haller goes through all of the fall and winter battling cancer, successfully recovers from the treatment and 2 operations, comes back, and this Borussia Dortmund side is completely transformed. And, that actually kind of makes you wonder what happens if Sebastian Haller does not get this diagnosis. What happens if he does stay fit throughout this entire season? It's hypotheticals, of course, but I think the title race would be over, Stefan.
Yeah, it's a fair point actually, and it also kind of offers up some hope to Dortmund next season as well. In the hope that this isn't just a sort of flash in the pan, rich vein of form rather, and it might all fall apart next season because they do have the tools now to dominate. And it's not just Haller, of course. What I mean by that is it's not just his goals and assists. It's the presence that he brings to Dortmund. You can evidently see how Daniel Malen just loves to play off him. You can see how Adeyemi just loves to play off him. Same with Julian Brandt, same with Jude Bellingham. And, not to kind of put a dark twist on this, I guess, because we're trying to celebrate the fact that Dortmund's about to win a title, but say if someone like Jude Bellingham does move on this summer, there's still a huge amount of hope in that Dortmund team in the sense that, they've still got this front three who know exactly how to play off each other. They all play so well. You might have to spend some money kind of fixing up the middle of the park, but to have those 3 players and how well they play off each other is just really impressive, And I completely agree with you. It's night and day compared to Bayern. It's night and day compared to the rest of the league. And actually, if you kind of look at it across the pitch, or across the league round, and we've talked about this in recent bonus show about the lack of number 9s in the Bundesliga, Sebastian Haller really stands alone in that regard, aside from maybe 1 or 2 other players like Füllkrug, or maybe if you want to consider Colomwani a number 9, which I'm not entirely sure you would, but maybe you would for argument's sake. He really does stand alone in that regard, and he has allowed this Dortmund team to kind of click into gear, which is really impressive because you kind of look back to how Dortmund played with Erling Haaland in the team last season, and yeah, he scored the goals, and yeah, he got the headlines, and we said this at the time, Dortmund are winning games, kinda, and Erling Haaland scoring goals for fun, but Dortmund last season were a very direct team that punted the ball right past their midfield, past their wingers, and they were constantly trying to catch teams on the back foot and allow Haaland to kind of run in and score goals. And that was fine and it was fun for a while, but you could see the limitations in that because it meant that if Haaland was either injured or if a team sat deep, no one else in the team was really willing to kind of take any responsibility, or simply didn't have to take any responsibility. That's been completely inverted this season, and you can see the way that, and this is a really good example of what Terzic has done right. You can see that he's somehow managed to get through to guys like Julian Brandt, Adeyemi, Daniel Malen, all of them really. Guerrero and Brandt in particular actually are 2 players who've really frustrated Dortmund fans for a number of seasons now. They've had good seasons, they've had bad seasons. Both of them have really come into a fantastic run of form. And I think that's a testament to Terzic, to the fact that he's clearly sat down with his team and said, you all have to take responsibility here. You all have to step up. It's not a case of Haller scoring the goals. It's not a case of, Adeyemi scoring the goals. Everyone has to kind of take control here. And that's what this team have done. That's what they did against Augsburg. And not only is it really encouraging for the sense that they're about to win a title, but it's also hugely encouraging for them going forward, in the sense that, they're no longer a team defined by one or two star players who will inevitably move on. They're now a fully fledged, functioning team, possibly capable of even more than just, challenging Dortmund for Bayern for the odd title.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting too. There was a report by Konstantin Eckner for ESPN. We had Eckner on at the show before, right? And he's kind of written an article on what Dortmund have changed during the World Cup break, and it's interesting too, because we've been asked whether we need to give Terzic more credit here, and I think that's true. We do, but I think it's also really interesting that he has essentially responded to some of the shortcomings that we've addressed in the first half of the season, right? In that he has now a different role as a head coach, and it sounds like he's almost more of a manager now, in the traditional English sense, right? Where he just basically works on the tactics. He does one-on-one conversations with the players, but the actual coaching is happening with other members of the staff, right? And I actually think that this is really quite fascinating, right? That Terzic, because like one of our accusations was that, well, he's a bit of a cheerleader, right? He's a super fan turned head coach, which is fine, because like he's also obviously has very good tactical ideas, but it seemed like there were some fundamentals missing in terms of training. And in Dortmund's, we have to applaud Dortmund and the decision makers at Dortmund to see this and address it and still preserve the working relationship, right? So I think that is really something that changed as well. And I think that is actually also kind of key, right? If you want to have success as a club. One thing that has frustrated me for years about Borussia Dortmund was their lack of ability to change. The fact that they were always going to be on the same course. We're going to steer this course. We're going to be always Borussia Dortmund. We're going to wait for Bayern Munich to be weak, which in fairness, they did. But, when you look at the after World Cup Bundesliga table, then it becomes quite clear that they were actually excellent, right? They have made up for their poor start. So I think that's all really interesting. I think that there is things that have happened within Borussia Dortmund that have addressed shortcomings in the right way. And yes, maybe without a World Cup break, that doesn't happen. But the World Cup break is a reality that every single Bundesliga club faces, right? Bayern Munich too, we're going into the World Cup break with known problems, right? It wasn't like they were running away with the Bundesliga table at that point. There was other teams challenging them. And they did have that spell for 4 games where they didn't win a single game, right? So they had shortcomings themselves. And it's really interesting how the two different teams took that extensive break. One of them addressed the issues correctly and had the fortune that their star striker came back, right? And the other team essentially said, well, we're leading the table, we're fine. And then just to completely blow it up in the international break in March, right? And literally breaking up. They pressed the red button on this, didn't they? And it's kind of like that Oppenheimer movie where they're worried and that the world could blow up when they press the red button. Well, for Bayern, unfortunately, blew up. But yeah, here we are. I think Stefan, it is super exciting, and obviously the title race is going to dominate it for us for the rest of the week in terms of what we're writing and in terms of what we're going to report on. But we also have to. I want to kind of slowly transition this to the other things that are happening in the Bundesliga.